Can I just get a bit of a show of hands of how many people are working in the field of ecological restoration on ground in water? Wow, what an excellent swathe of hands just went up. And agencies, policy areas and management? That's good, that's great. What about research side? Wow, what a nice smattering of hands. And who have I missed? Yell it out from the bleachers. Nobody. Wow, that's nice. We can summarise ecological restoration participation into 3 groups. So, yes, I'm here today to talk about how our project, the National Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration in Australia, focuses on reference ecosystems as native ecosystems. And you would think, of course it does, but some question that. So my talk is in that context. The standards were developed by the SERA Standards Reference Group in collaboration with 12 other NGOs, Australian NGOs. I won't list them, but they're listed in the cover of the standards. Now, the core premise is that ecological restoration is assisting the recovery of native ecosystems. Now, that doesn't mean that non-native species are not involved in ecological restoration. Of course they are. They're often appreciated as facilitators of recovery, but they're not the end in itself. And a reference ecosystem is a model for what we're aiming for. However, still, people question whether native ecosystems are necessarily what we should be using as models if even intact ecosystems are being affected by human impacts. Does it mean they're untenable and therefore irrelevant? Well, I hope that this talk will help clarify that no, that's not the case. Also, some people wonder, does this mean that restoration excludes people? No, it's simply about what is an ecological restoration project? How do we ensure that we have appropriate standards of practice? Now, to quote Don Falk, who was a former director of the Society for Ecological Restoration, some ecological changes already appear catastrophic and potentially irreversible. This is a slide borrowed from him. He presented to the SERA Europe conference only a couple of weeks ago and delivered the message that really humans are faced with an enormous challenge, that ecosystems are being faced with an enormous existential threat. He calls the challenge, he says, reversing climate change is mission critical. But so is protecting and restoring biodiversity. And this puts it into context for us. It's not a matter of either or. Protecting and restoring biodiverse native ecosystems is a major reason for reversing climate change. And it's also a major mechanism for reversing climate change. It's not the only reason and it's not the only mechanism. Addressing causes. So ecological restoration is, and the standards reiterate this, we need to address the causes before we can assume that we can have any potential for success. Complementary activities that improve the ways we use land, water and air are highly relevant to ecological restoration, even if they don't directly restore biodiversity. They may be part of an ecological restoration project if you're looking at the scale that includes all those efforts as well. But what we need to remember is that ecological restoration and complementary activities are joined at the hip. They're two sides of the one coin. We cannot do without each other if our goal is the reinstatement of functional native ecological systems. So the Society for Ecological Restoration parent group, as well as Society for Ecological Restoration Australasia, emphasise in their standards documents relationships between ecological restoration and other activities. So these are essential for reducing damage and improving the functionality of ecosystems. Now, the term we use is to We seek to encourage restorative thinking and restorative actions. So restorative in this case is used as an adjective, even though it may not be strictly an ecological restoration project. All land and water management can be framed and directed towards a restorative approach that has outcomes that benefit native ecosystems. So you can imagine, many of you are already involved in all these restorative activities as either part of your restoration project or as complementary activities. So basically we're avoiding damage at the consumer and producer end of the broader landscape. We're better managing land and water to avoid inadvertent damage. We are avoiding introducing invasives if they are going to be causing ecosystem dysfunction. Some invasives may not cause ecosystem dysfunction. Some may be actually beneficial. Some may be temporary surrogates for missing native species or native functions. Obviously, this is the big one. The clearing of ecosystems. We need to avoid clearing, and particularly where native ecosystems or extant ecosystems provide connectivity. We have to cease the process of fragmentation, reduce and remediate contamination. All these things are complementary, if not part of a restoration project. We need to work with communities to increase ecological literacy and community engagement in the ultimate care of ecosystems. And so what we're needing to do is transform our cultures and economics to more sustainable, restorative cultures and businesses to replace those that are still part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And it's going to be a slow transformation, but I have optimism. We have to, that this is possible. So SERA, and this goes back to the topic of this talk, the Society for Ecological Restoration in Australasia needs to seek to involve all contributions relevant to the restoration of ecosystems or the recovery of ecosystems in things such as this conference or conferences and other activities that SERA organises. Now, you'll see that there's a variety of topics covered in this conference, and this is very healthy. We've got case studies on restoration, including full recovery cases, partial recovery cases that are integrated into utilised landscapes, rehabilitation where it's complementary. We've got the full restoration continuum, or restorative, let me put it that way, continuum, where you're including restoration and rehabilitation and improved utilisation in an integrated package. We have lots and lots of talks about monitoring tools, research on social policy and standards. We've got presentations on social outreach, better planning, improved on-ground tools, linking science and practice, lots of research on ecology and networking. So it's a very healthy diversity, and we want to keep it that way. We possibly could encourage in the future more restorative projects that influence the reduction of causal factors, but in doing so we would like to make a clear connection between those projects and the outcome of improving the condition of native ecosystems. So the standards, the international standards includes this diagram, which is also conceptually in the national standards. What we have here is a diagram showing that there's a continuum. At one end we've got sustainable utilisation, in the centre rehabilitation, and at the right-hand end ecological restoration. This is not that one is a lesser activity than another. As you can see from the little subheading underneath the main heading, these describe the appropriate intervention to best meet the need between what is on the left-hand side social needs. The social needs predominate at that end, and at the right-hand side, ecological needs predominate. So we're talking about horses for courses. What is the most appropriate activity at which part of the spectrum? So at the sustainable utilisation end, you'll be looking at preventing degradation. It might be to do with renewable energy. It might be to do with reducing plastic wastes in the oceans. It might be to do with economic models. In the middle, we're talking about how we manage land and water so that we achieve ecosystem services and economic benefits. And at the ecological restoration end, and that's not necessarily isolated at one end of the landscape, it's infused throughout, we have native ecosystems re-establishing. So at the same time as encouraging this broad-scale restorative continuum, SER reaffirms the industry standard that anything calling itself an ecological restoration project needs to be focusing on native ecosystems and using a reference ecosystem that is based on a native ecosystem. Now, that brings us back to whether these things are tenable in this day and age, this age of climate change. Now, I just want to run this past you. I think a lot of people think that ecological restoration and using a reference ecosystem that's native means that we're always aiming for full recovery. That's not the case. The practice of ecological restoration is to strive for similarity to the reference ecosystem or reference model that you have gone to a lot of trouble to design, insofar as possible. So the fact that you may not be able to achieve that for some practical reason or reason of social desirability doesn't mean that your project is no longer called ecological restoration. It can be. So we ask ourselves, are the current site conditions still broadly suitable for what would be there had the degradation not occurred? If that is the case, then you use the model of the ecosystem that would be there had the degradation not occurred. So if that isn't possible because of some sort of ambient change or some sort of physical change, can you amend those physical conditions? If yes, amend those conditions and use that ecosystem as your model. If you can't, can the conditions suit an alternative native ecosystem or a state of that ecosystem that is more feasible and desirable? And this is a very important enablement, I guess, for ecological restoration, because we can't always aim for the gold standard. So it's necessary and desirable to achieve an outcome which is about healthy native ecosystems, not necessarily at all about prior ecosystems, even though we would like that to be the case. So in that case, you'd use an alternative. And if that is not possible, that is when you use the site or design a project to achieve a more restorative management of that site or that ecosystem. Just to illustrate a couple of examples, many of us went to a pre-conference field trip to the Big Scrub in northern New South Wales. Now, the reference ecosystem for most of the sites there is the prior ecosystem, and here's an example at Victoria Park in Alstonville, where inside the square is the remnant, and the triangular bits on the top and right-hand side of that remnant, they're replantings, but they're replantings that harness natural resilience that's some dispersal by birds and bats of species coming from the remnant. So it's totally appropriate to use the prior ecosystem or the existing ecosystem in that case. That does not mean, though, that we're looking to the past. We do need to maintain an attitude of openness with regard potential for that ecosystem in its natural state to be reorganising in relation to such pressures as climate change. where the conditions are broadly suitable but full recovery is not necessarily socially appropriate, you may achieve partial recovery, and that is still ecological restoration. And this is an example from the Riverina, the travelling stock routes. So we've got 13,000 hectares of travelling stock routes that are under restoration and rehabilitation management in the Murray local area, and the condition of those sites has improved from approximately on a 5-star scale from about condition 2 to condition 3 or 4, which is a magnificent achievement, and we should be proud of that. Full recovery is not necessarily always the best outcome. We remember here we're looking at grazed landscapes, and we want to keep that function. We want to keep that social outcome. So this is ecological restoration, but it's part also of a social continuum. Here we have an interesting case where the conditions weren't suitable. This is very old, in some cases 80 to 100-year-old degradation, clay pans from serious erosion in Western New South Wales and elsewhere, where the physical conditions needed to be amended for any recovery to occur. But the prior ecosystem was still the reference used here. And it's still partial recovery because this is on private land that is grazed, and what is paid for the restoration here is the utilisation of the sites by pastoralists. So your target ecosystem, that is what you're aiming for, isn't exactly the reference ecosystem because they're keeping trees out of the system in order to maintain the herbaceous layer, but we're still maintaining a reference ecosystem of the Kenneprob grassland of that local area. Now here's a case where you've got conditions that cannot be reversed to suit the former ecosystem. So this is a case in Cairns in Queensland where pastoral management has exposed acid sulphate soils, which then became active and created a great deal of acid drainage. The treatment involved flooding those soils permanently with seawater to the point where they did not flood the grazing sites as well. So this is a socially modified project, and it shifted it from a freshwater wetland to a saline wetland. Now these are equally, if not more, threatened ecological communities. So this is still considered ecological restoration. And finally, in these case studies, ecological restoration has been carried out on sites to test potential for switching whole ecosystems to alternative ecosystems in cases where we expect sea level rise. So that you can see from this that ecological restoration really actually is highly inclusive, that the standards are not really saying, it's got to be what it was before and it's got to be totally like it was before, or it's not ecological restoration. However, we are aiming to infuse the whole process with a degree of discipline so that we have a guide, a model of prior or existing native ecosystems. We're not making them up. We're not designing ecosystems. We may have to somewhere. We may have to in a great many places. But if we don't keep our native ecosystems going, we stand to lose a great deal of natural heritage. So to lose the distinction between ecological restoration and other complementary activities would actually disempower both, because you don't want ecological restoration everywhere. Things on the left-hand side of the social ecological continuum, the restorative continuum, need to be more directed towards social outcomes to meet social needs. And similarly, those at the more ecocentric end of that continuum need to be more directed towards ecological outcomes. So we're encouraging participants in all these fields to think in terms of benefits for native ecosystems, even if there isn't a direct outcome. And we see this as potentially a unifying force in our restoration community, so that membership of SERA can include more than merely ecological restoration practitioners, but also managers who undertake rehabilitation and other complementary works that are fundamental to resolving problems that allow ecological restoration to take place. So there are countless projects occurring around the world, and there are many initiatives, I won't read these out, to encourage restoration and complementary projects. Now, often they say in these documents restoration. Sometimes they say ecological restoration, but a lot of these global initiatives use the term restoration generically to include both ecological restoration and complementary work. And we must keep this broad view. Now, a few weeks ago I was stunned to see on the news photographs of very, very large meetings in Beijing, I think it was, where there were 40 African heads of state all in the one room. It's been a series of years of meetings between China and Africa. This is just an example of the new world we are now being faced with. There are many countries in the world where there is a desire to develop. The global population will increase by 25% in the next 20 years. Urban migration will continue, leaving rural areas with potential opportunities for restoration and rehabilitation. There will be a massive demand for infrastructure support. Now, I'm very, very interested to see the directions China is moving in. In particular, the Chinese President Xi Jinping is committed to and very impressed with the concepts of ecological civilization, which, if you look it up on Wikipedia, includes a balance between social outcomes and ecological outcomes. So this is the inspiring direction, thank goodness, some of our international powers are directed towards. The slide I showed you before about the water ponding in the agricultural areas has actually engaged with African trainees and attracted 71 trainees from 28 different African countries to come and learn the skills of designing water ponds that could rehabilitate degraded areas. My point here is that we would like to see ecological civilization as including the restoration of native ecosystems. We need to be emphasising the importance of native ecosystems because it is so very easy for people to think that they are no longer relevant or no longer viable. I hope that I've shown you that they are. Thank you.